Now let me take you back in history to the events leading up to the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. On the 23rd of November of that year, a 33-ship Japanese task force assembled off one of the northern islands of Japan. On that date, they sailed due east across the northern Pacific, headed for the Hawaiian Islands. About dawn on the 7th of December, this task force was located approximately 200 miles northeast of the island of Oahu. In taking this route across the northern Pacific, they were not once detected. The United States Navy was aware that this task force had left Japan. They sent some ships out to look for it. They never found it. They were looking off to the south, never suspecting this task force would take the northern route, which at that time of year is very rough, being in the middle of the winter. Making up this large task force were cruisers, destroyers, large fleet-type submarines, troop ships, and supply ships. In the nucleus of the task force, there were 6 aircraft carriers. On board, they had 353 aircraft. They were torpedo planes and dive bombers. They began launching aircraft about 6 a.m. that morning, just before the sun came up. They launched them in 10-minute intervals in different waves and groups. It took the planes less than 2 hours to fly the 200 miles to Oahu. As they got closer, they split into 3 separate groups. The first group of planes came in from the west. The second group came in from the north across the Ko'olau mountain range, and the third group came in from the east across Diamond Head. The planes converged on Pearl Harbor and Hickam Air Force Base at about 5 minutes to 8. There was some action outside of Pearl Harbor much earlier that morning. At about 3:45, the minesweeper Condor was on patrol duty just outside the harbor. They spotted a midget submarine that was operating in a restricted sea area. Having no weapons on board a minesweeper, they radioed a message to the destroyer Ward that was coming out of the Pearl Harbor Channel. The Ward responded immediately, but when they arrived at the scene, they could find nothing. The submarine had submerged. The Ward patrolled near the entrance, and a few hours later, as the sun was coming up about 7 o'clock, they spotted this sub again. They took it under fire and sunk it. They then radioed a message to the commander of the 14th Naval District in Pearl Harbor of what action had taken place. If this message had been released to our fleet in time, they would have had 55 minutes to prepare for the pending attack. Being a Sunday morning, none of the high-ranking naval officers could be found. They were all on shore leave. The junior officers at the message center did not want to take the responsibility of releasing this message for fear it might be false, so they were not warned in time. There were 5 of these midget submarines that were brought to Oahu on the decks of larger subs and launched once they came within range. They were manned by 2 men, more or less, on a suicide mission. The forward section of these subs was fitted with a large bomb for ramming. The previous evening, one of them washed up on the windward side of the island. They had developed some steering problems, and the commander of that submarine became our first prisoner of war. 2 of these subs got inside of the harbor. They went through the submarine nets that had been left open accidentally. Some of our ships that were leaving port after the attack began spotted these 2 subs, took them under fire, and sunk them also. All 5 midget subs were either sunk or captured. They inflicted no damage on the fleet. The destroyer Ward was credited by firing the first shot of the war in the Pacific. Ironically, to the day, December 7th of 1944, the destroyer Ward was sunk off one of the islands in the Philippines by a kamikaze aircraft. Ford Island, where the greatest concentration of the attack took place, mostly at Battleship Row, where we had 7 of the 8 battleships tied within a few yards of each other. There was a naval air station located on Ford Island back in 1941. There were some 390 of our own aircraft that were scattered all about the island of Oahu that day at many of the other airfields. Most of them were right on Ford Island. These planes had been grouped very closely together near the hangars. This was so they could be watched more closely for sabotage. They were expecting something. This made a very inviting target for the attacking planes coming in, and as a result, most of the planes were destroyed right on the ground. The bombs damaged the runways so badly they could get none of the heavy planes into the air, although they did manage to get 38 fighters off the ground, 2 of them from Ford Island, the rest from the other airfields. They were trying to stop the methodical bombing of our ships. 10 of these 38 were shot down not only by the attacking planes, but mostly by our own gunners on the ships and on the ground. They were shooting at anything that flew near them, very confused. And to add to the confusion, the Army Air Force insignia we had painted on our planes had a red circle in the center of a blue star. This was exactly the same as the red circle on the attacking planes. After the attack, this red circle was removed from our insignia for obvious reasons. On the western side of Ford Island are the old seaplane runways. This was approximately the same position that the destroyer Monaghan spotted one of the midget submarines that got inside of the harbor. They fired several shells at it and missed. Eventually, they rammed it, and they sent it to the bottom. This midget sub was later raised, and it toured the United States on the deck of a railroad flat car, along with the slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor." This was in conjunction with a war bond drive that was going on at the time. As I mentioned before, the first group of planes that came into Pearl Harbor came in from the west. The reason for this, they expected to find 3 of our aircraft carriers tied up to the piers on the western side of Ford Island. These piers are known as Aircraft Carrier Row. We did have 3 carriers attached to our Pacific Fleet. They were based in Pearl Harbor. They were the Lexington, the Enterprise, and the Saratoga. Japanese intelligence had informed their fleet they would find these 3 carriers in port. Fortunately, they were not. The Lexington had left 3 days before with 3 cruisers and 5 destroyers on a search and destroy mission. The Enterprise was 130 miles from Pearl Harbor when the attack began, and the Saratoga was at Mare Island Shipyard in California undergoing minor repairs. If these 3 carriers had been in port, or any one of them, they most likely would have been the first to come under attack and possibly would have gone to the bottom. This would have prolonged the war in the Pacific. For 5 short months after the attack, these same 3 aircraft carriers and many of our other warships managed to stop the Japanese advance to Midway. Here the Japanese lost most of their aircraft carriers and one of their very large battleships. This battle at Midway proved to be the turning point in World War II, and most historians will agree with this. There were some ships tied up on that side of Ford Island. One of them is still there, visible just above the water, the superstructure of the ex-battleship Utah. In 1931, the Utah was converted from a battleship to a mobile target vessel. Her large guns were removed, and they covered her decks with cement. This was to protect her from practice water bombs that would be dropped on her by our own aircraft during bombing practice. She was also entirely remote controlled. She was the first experimental vessel of her kind. She could be maneuvered from another ship or an aircraft. The only crew she would have on board would be a small fire room crew of 6 to 8 men to watch the controls. Then in 1935, the Utah was converted again to a naval gunnery training ship. She had mounted on her decks the latest anti-aircraft weapons we had at that time. In 1940, the Utah was brought back to Pearl Harbor, and her crew was training the other men in how to use these new weapons. They would soon be mounted on the decks of their own ships. This was most likely the major reason the Utah was the first ship to come under attack and go to the bottom. There was another possibility with her cement decks. She did somewhat resemble one of our smaller carriers, and she was tied up at Aircraft Carrier Row. After the attack, Japanese intelligence stated they had sunk the aircraft carrier Enterprise, when in fact they had not. The attack began at 5 minutes to 8. 17 minutes later, at 8:12, the Utah had rolled over to her port side, and she settled to the bottom of Pearl Harbor, a total loss. She was the victim of torpedo planes coming in from the west. On board her that morning was a skeleton crew of 519 men. Of this number, 461 did get off in time. They never had a chance to man their new weapons. The ship went down so fast beneath them. 58 members of the crew were trapped in the lower deck compartments or were killed by strafing attack. Most of them went to the bottom of Pearl Harbor with her, and to this day are still presumed to be entombed within her rusting hull. The Navy did try to recover these bodies, as well as the numerous ones on board the Arizona. They did rescue one man that was still alive by cutting through the bottom. But some Navy divers were killed as they were trying to cut through her sides. They were hitting gas-filled compartments, and she still had ammunition left on board. The Navy considered this a needless loss of life, and the attempt was abandoned. The USS Utah was declared out of commission in 1944. A bronze plaque was mounted in the cement superstructure a few feet above the water. It was placed there by the 461 survivors. It reads quite simply, "In memory of the officers and men, USS Utah, lost in action December 7th, 1941. On December 7th of 1971, 30 years later, there were groundbreaking ceremonies for the memorial built out to her at the present time. This memorial was dedicated on Memorial Day of 1972. And now, please join me in a moment of silence in remembrance of these men. After being at the bottom of Pearl Harbor for all these years, the USS Utah once again flies our country's flag. Moored just ahead of the Utah were two more ships, the light cruiser Raleigh and her sister ship, the Detroit. The Raleigh came under attack. She was hit by several torpedoes and a bomb similar to the one that hit the Arizona. This bomb went completely through the Raleigh. It exploded in the mud beneath her. Miraculously, no one was killed, although several men were wounded. The men were trying to keep their ship afloat and trying to fight off the attacking planes at the same time. They did shoot down several of them. The Raleigh was kept afloat by large salvage pontoons until they could patch her bottom and get her into dry dock. The Detroit also came under attack, but she was not hit. An aerial torpedo was launched at her, but when the torpedo hit the water, it bounced, throwing the aim off. The torpedo missed the cruiser and hit Ford Island. It exploded and caused no damage. The crew from the Detroit also filled the sky with anti-aircraft fire. They shot down several more of the planes. The Detroit got underway at 1 o'clock that afternoon, joined the rest of the fleet in the open ocean in search for the attacking task force. They never found it. They were still looking off to the south, never suspecting the task force was only 200 miles northeast of Oahu. On the north side of Pearl Harbor is East Lock. This was an anchorage area where destroyers, destroyer escorts, and various auxiliaries were either anchored or tied up to large mooring buoys. Being at anchor or tied to these buoys, they all had a head of steam up in their boilers. And as the attack began, they simply picked up their anchors and headed for the open ocean. They filled the sky with anti-aircraft fire as they went, many of them without even being noticed. It appeared the attacking planes were interested in trying to destroy the aircraft on the ground and trying to sink the battleships. There was a very important ship anchored in East Lock that morning, the hospital ship Solace. She was painted white with large red crosses on both sides. The attacking planes respected the red crosses. The Solace was never touched. This was very fortunate. After the attack, there were over 3,000 casualties. The men and equipment on board the Solace were very badly needed. They were using the medical facilities all over the island of Oahu. There were 94 ships in Pearl Harbor that morning. There was a good reason for it. The United States was committed to protecting not only the Hawaiian Islands, but all of the South Pacific Islands as well. They were building up the fleet in the Pacific. There was a good possibility that we would be getting into World War II, but no one ever dreamed it would begin in Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7th, we had 5 submarines in port. Their crews submerged them alongside of the piers so they could not be seen from the air. All of this area was a very prime target, but it was never touched. Speculation had it the attacking fleet would be coming in to invade the islands. They would need the fuel and the supplies for their own ships. In actuality, this would have happened if the 3 aircraft carriers had been in port and if they had sunk them. But as I mentioned before, fortunately, they were not. Battleship roll. This is where we had 7 of the 8 battleships tied within a few yards of each other, and where, in the first 30 minutes of the attack, we lost over 2,000 men in the service of their country. At the first 2 mooring quays was the battleship USS Nevada. Early in the attack, she was hit by 1 torpedo, but not too badly damaged. Her fire room crew got up steam in about 20 minutes. The Nevada was the only battleship that cleared the moorings that morning. The Navy considered it quite impossible for a battleship to clear the moorings without the assistance of tugs. That morning, the crew on the Nevada performed the impossible. As they got underway, they just narrowly missed the flaming stern of the Arizona. As the Nevada proceeded down South Channel, she was converged on by dive bombers and hit several more times. They were trying to sink her in the channel. When the Nevada reached the southwestern end of Ford Island, she was in a very serious sinking condition. Her crew decided to beach her. They did so by backing her hard astern into the mud. This proved to be a very wise decision. Her decks never went below the surface of the water. She was repaired and sent back to the fleet in less than 3 months, and she finished out World War II. At the next mooring quays, the USS Arizona. She had been hit by 5 torpedoes, but not too badly damaged. Her fire room crew was getting up steam as fast as they could. They were preparing to get her underway also. They had almost all of her mooring lines thrown off when the Arizona was hit by a 1,000-pound armor-piercing shell. It penetrated the forward deck. It went several decks below and exploded, starting a very bad fire. This fire spread rapidly throughout the forward section of the ship. Eventually, it reached the powder magazines where ship's ammunition and explosives were stored. When this occurred, there was a violent eruption. The Arizona was almost completely torn in two by this internal explosion, and she settled to the bottom of Pearl Harbor in a mass of flames in the incredible time of less than 9 minutes. The Arizona is 609 feet long. She weighed out over 32,000 tons. It seems impossible that a ship of this size could go to the bottom in such a short time, but she did. On board the Arizona that morning was a crew count of 1,550 men. Of this number, only 289 survived. 150 bodies were later recovered from the harbor and the ship itself. 1,177 men never had a chance. They went to the bottom of Pearl Harbor with her, and to this day are still presumed to be entombed within her rusting hull. At the far end of the memorial, inscribed on a marble wall, are listed the names of every one of these men, including a 2-star admiral and the Arizona's commanding officer. At the base of the flagpole, there is a bronze plaque with Admiral Radford's dedication of this memorial to all of these men. The dedication reads, "Dedicated to the eternal memory of our gallant shipmates in the USS Arizona, who gave their lives in action December 7th, 1941. From today on, the USS Arizona will again fly our country's flag just as proudly as she did on the morning of December 7th. I am sure the Arizona's crew will know and appreciate what we are doing, and may God make his face to shine upon them and grant them peace. The Arizona's flag does fly at full staff. The Navy still sentimentally considers her to be in commission. She still has over 3/4 of her crew left on board. Her flag is proudly raised every morning by an honor guard, lowered each evening at sunset. All naval ships, when coming within 500 yards, the crew comes to full attention, and they render a hand salute in honor of their fallen shipmates. There are many ways of paying respects to these men. Please join me again in a moment of silence in honor of this great battleship with most of her crew still on board. You can see a round rusting section. That is the barbette to her number 3 aftergun turret. The two mushroom-shaped objects are ventilator covers going to her engine room and crew's quarters. At the entrance to the memorial, the top of the stairs can be seen the ship's bell and the scale model of the Arizona. The architect's design of the memorial is quite unique. You will note it was built in the shape of a V. The low center section of the V symbolizing the initial defeat suffered that morning, in contrast to the upswept ends pointing skyward, symbolizing the final victory that was achieved by our forces some 4 years later. The 7 vertical windows on either side symbolize the 7th day of December. The small cutouts on the right side are religious symbols dating back many years, meaning the way of life. This memorial is truly a national monument. For still entombed within the Arizona's hull, we have men from every state in the Union, every territory of the United States, and 4 men from the Philippines. The memorial was built through public donation at the cost of $1.5 million. It was dedicated on Memorial Day of 1962. It was dedicated not only to all these men still left on board the Arizona, but to the over 2,000 men that gave their lives here on December 7th. This memorial is quite a tribute to all of these men. It has been said the debt cannot be repaid, it can only be acknowledged. We hope that they did not die in vain, and may they rest in peace. Moored just ahead of the Arizona that morning were 2 more battleships tied alongside of each other, the USS West Virginia and the Tennessee. The West Virginia was the outboard vessel. She was hit by 6 torpedoes in rapid succession. She went to the bottom of Pearl Harbor very fast, trapping many of her crew members below decks. She had her decks awash and she was on fire. The Tennessee, being inboard, was protected from torpedoes. She was hit by 2 of the aerial bombs, not too badly damaged. She was repaired and sent back to the fleet within 6 months. The West Virginia was raised, repaired, and she was back with the fleet about a year later. At the next pier in line, we had 2 more battleships alongside of each other, the USS Oklahoma and the Maryland. The Oklahoma was the outboard vessel. She was hit by 5 torpedoes. She went to the bottom of Pearl Harbor within 20 minutes, taking 415 of her crew with her. As she sunk, she rolled over. 3 days later, men from the shipyard and some of the Oklahoma survivors cut through her overturned bottom, rescuing 32 men that were still alive. They had been tapping on the inside of the hull. She was raised in 1944, no longer needed. She was sold for scrap. As the Oklahoma was being towed back to the mainland of California, they ran into a Pacific storm and she sunk. The Maryland, being inboard, was protected from torpedoes, just like the Tennessee. She was hit by one bomb, the least damaged of all the battleships. She was repaired and sent back to the fleet in less than 90 days. Just ahead of the Oklahoma and the Maryland was a gasoline tanker, the Neosho. She had 500,000 gallons of aviation gasoline on board. If this ship had been hit, this end of Pearl Harbor would have been a flaming inferno. Her crew disregarded the gasoline fumes. They were the first ship on that side of Pearl Harbor to open up their guns against the attacking planes. They shot down the first one. The Neosho was moved 45 minutes later to a safer spot. She was never touched. At the last two mooring quays was the battleship USS California. Much earlier that morning, her crew had opened up all of her watertight compartments in preparation for an inspection. After being hit by several torpedoes, her lower decks were flooded throughout, and she was listing badly when the dive bombers moved in. They left her a flaming wreck. She had raging fires on board for 3 days and 3 nights. Finally, the Navy sent her to the bottom to extinguish all her fires. She was repaired and back with the fleet, participating in many of the major campaigns during World War II. Also on that side of Pearl Harbor is the Naval Shipyard and the location of Dry Dock Number 1. This is where we had the 8th and final battleship, the USS Pennsylvania. She was flagship of the Pacific Fleet at that time under Admiral Halsey. In the dry dock with her were 2 of our destroyers, the Cassin and the Downs. They were more or less protected from torpedoes by the dry dock gate. They came under very severe dive bomber attack. The Pennsylvania sustained a direct hit on her forward gun turret, but not too badly damaged. The 2 destroyers, Cassin and Downs, were so badly demolished they had to be scrapped. Most of their machinery was taken off and put into other vessels that were being built at that time. The 2 new ones retained the names of Cassin and Downs. That is why the names were not stricken from the active list. The Pennsylvania, in company with the battleships Maryland and the Tennessee, left Pearl Harbor on December 20th of 1941. They went back to California for repairs. They had to flood the dry dock to put out the fires. As they did so, one of the destroyers came off of keel blocks and fell against the other one. To the right of dry dock number 1 was floating dry dock number 2. In that dry dock was the destroyer USS Shaw. She had received a direct hit in her forward powder magazine. The bomb did not go off immediately. It did start fires, and everyone abandoned ship. 2 hours later, the powder magazine blew up. When the smoke cleared, they found out she was only missing her bow section. Carpenters from the shipyard fashioned a wooden bow to her. She made it back to the coast of California under her own power. As she came under the Golden Gate Bridge, the Shaw received quite an ovation. She was refitted in San Francisco and finished out World War II. And now to give you a summary of what took place during the 2-hour attack. We lost 2,409 men in the service of their country. 18 of our ships were either sunk or badly damaged. This was in very sharp contrast to the Japanese loss of 64 men, 29 aircraft, and 5 midget submarines. We did repair 13 of the 18 sunk or damaged ships. They took up the offensive in the Pacific War. We lost 5 ships in all: the USS Utah, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the 2 destroyers, Cassin and Downs. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, all the rest of the attacking planes were safely back aboard the 6 aircraft carriers, and the large task force departed for Japan. But as Admiral Yamamoto commented later on that day, I am afraid the only thing we have succeeded in doing is awakening a sleeping giant. For during World War II, the U.S. Navy hunted down and sank 32 of the original 33 ships that launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the bitter war in the Pacific formally ended on the quarterdeck of the battleship USS Missouri with unconditional surrender. This took place in Tokyo Bay, Japan, on the 2nd of September, 1945. Yes, it did happen. It is very much a part of our American history. Most of us are willing to forgive and forget, but it will always remain in the pages of history as the day of infamy.